No, I had not done it yet. This was one of the things that I had videoed back when I hadn't hit play. So I'm glad I checked because I wanted to show you this. But it ends up relating to the Gunnar Myrdal stuff I was just talking about. All right, let me explain here a contrast between a neoclassical view of a particular issue and an institutionalist one. There's this guy named Gary Becker, who we're also going to talk about in the feminist chapter, and he came up with all this stuff about applying neoclassical economics to household things like marriage and family, and in this case, race. And one of the arguments he made, and he made it more sophisticated later, but one of the arguments he made was, hey, the market system will destroy racism. Like this. Let's say we've got two employers, one of whom is a racist, one is not a racist, all right? And let's do the American South in the 1950s. So this is both white business owners, and the racist is racist against blacks, all right? And I shall use my black pen for black people and my green pen for white people because I can't write with white on a whiteboard. Let's say they're out to hire 4 people. They want to hire four new employees. 4 employees. They each want 4 employees. And let's further say that each has the ability to figure out exactly how good someone would be at a job on a scale of 1 to 10. So there's no question here. And let's make more white people than black just because it adds a little historical authenticity to the whole story that... Okay, I don't know how much of that you can see, but you can see all of it. All right. Let's say that we've got these white applicants have shown up, and there's 3 10s, 3 9s, 3 8s. Again, this being a rating of how good they would be at the job, and on down. How well in focus is that? Not that great, actually. I think the problem is it's focusing on me. Okay, let me step out of the way for a second. Because it looked like it got a lot better when I stepped out of the way. All right, you can see that. Again, these are the white people that showed up for the interview, and then I'm going to make more white people than black people just because it doesn't make any difference to the example whatsoever. But we have the same percentages. We have 1/3 as many black people as white, so we've got 3 10s over here, 1 10, 1 9, 1 8, 1 7. So the distribution is the same. And again, we're assuming that these 2 individuals have the ability to exactly figure out how good you would be at a job. All right, they want to hire 4 people. Here's how the market destroys racism. They want to hire 4 people. And let's see, what color do I want to use here? Red. Red for racist, right? When the racist employer employs 4 people, they get 3 10s and a 9. When the non-racist hires 4 people, they get 4 10s. All right? So, Becker's argument is that eventually the market will destroy racism because what's going to happen is, let me slap my chair over here. What's going to happen is that me right there? It is. What's going to happen is that the non-racist, you can't see the top of my head, but the non-racist will outcompete the racist and therefore destroy racism. All right, so it's sort of a very simplistic neoclassical explanation of how great the market is, how the market is objective. All right, the market doesn't care. The market just wants efficiency. The institutionalist argument here would be, are you freaking kidding me? How long do you think it'll be before the non-racist house is burned down? How well do you think the 3 white employees are going to welcome the new black employee on the on the line where they're working or whatever? How many customers do you think the non-racist will still have after they take this act that is in defiance of the overall culture, right? That the market is simply a reflection of the rest of the culture. The market is not independent of the rest of the culture. The market is simply a reflection of those values. It is one of the many means by which a society makes its values felt. The market will reinforce and encourage the racist. People will go to the racist, even without the burning down and the violence. Just that the non-racist doesn't get any customers anymore, and the racist does. So this Gunnar Myrdal guy I was telling you about was writing this book about American race relations in the United States, and he was like, wow, I tried to explain it neoclassical, it didn't work. And he said, and then I decided to try to look at this from an institutionalist perspective where it was all intertwined, just as Paul Bush said, two value systems inherently incompatible intertwined within the institutional structure through a complex set of relationships, right? And the reason I brought this up was that Gunnar Myrdal not only said, boy, I'm finding it easier to explain this with institutionalism because he needed to draw from the various cultural impacts, but he also said in a footnote, man, if only there was a way to put all this stuff into the equivalent of a computer in 1947 to formalize these relationships. That's what Red Zicky's talking about. He's talking about formalizing the relationships in a computer simulation. So let me show you here what that's about. And by the way, something else that Myrdal said was, I found this part particularly sad. He had done a survey of what is it that black people want the most from desegregation in America back in the 1940s, and what is it that white people fear the most about desegregation? It was like the exact same list, but inverted. The things that white people were most afraid of, the blacks couldn't care less about it. Like, I'm not really worried about intermarriage. I just want a freaking job. Whereas what was at the bottom of the least feared things for white people was actually what the black people wanted. Anyway, isn't life complicated? Now, so here is then an attempt to sort of formalize some institutionalist concept using this is really a series of equations here. Let me show you some examples. All right, now, one of the most basic things about this approach, system dynamics, is that it says that the real world really works like this and not like this. This was invented by a guy named Jay Forrester, who was an engineer at MIT. He had been asked, hey, can you do some work with the business school? And he's like, well, why would I want to do that? But he did, and he's like, oh, actually, this is kind of interesting. Now that he's got to thinking about social systems rather than engineering issues, he said, wow, social systems work the same way as feedback does in some physical relationships. He apparently was instrumental in developing an anti-aircraft gun for the U.S. Pacific Fleet to shoot down kamikazes in particular. And it had some sort of feedback mechanism because, when you're shooting down an airplane, you have to anticipate where it's going to be. You can't shoot where it is because by the time the bullet gets there, the plane's gone. You have to anticipate. I don't know how it worked, but apparently that's what he was doing physically. And then you get to think about these things socially. He's like, people tend to think A causes C causes D, or A and B causing, but that's never the way it really works in real life. There's always feedback effects. Yes, B is causing D, which is causing E, which is causing C, which feeds back to B, all right? B is changed by what happens over here. That what we should really be looking for is not these ultimate root causes, but the structures, all right? And I'll give you some examples here, what he's talking about in just a second. Now, I don't want to go into this too much, but it talks about loop dominance. That there are going to be certain loops that are dominant, more important than others when you plan all this out. It's typically nonlinear, all right? That you don't get straight lines anymore. There's a lot of feedback. Changes take place endogenously. You don't need outside forces to change in order for their change to take place. And levels and rates, I don't want to talk about that, but it's an important concept, but not important enough. And the behavior is driven by system structure, all right? Different kinds of structures give different kinds of patterns over time. This looks like a business cycle, doesn't it? And indeed, I've used this to model business cycles. Business cycles typically include a negative feedback with a time lag, all right? But Forrester said the human mind is not adapted to interpreting how the human mind is better at thinking this way than this way. So Forrester says we need to use computers. It's too hard for us to do the feedback part. It's really difficult. So we need to use computers. And let me jump up here to that. Here's one of the computer models that people use, VenSim. There's also, what's another one called? It starts with an S. But anyway, the idea is that you plug all these equations in and then it generates the system behavior for you. Now, the advantage to this system is, here are the consequences of ignoring the way the real world works. Here are the consequences of assuming the real world works this way and not this way. And he argues that it's very common to find this in the real world where people haven't really considered the feedback effects. Let me do this one first. Counterintuitive behavior. In the 60s in the US, there was a shortage of houses in the inner city. You know what the government decided to do? Build more houses. Seems obvious, doesn't it? There's a shortage of housing. How do we fix it? Build more houses. What's his name? Forrester, I'm not getting very tired because, as I say, this is about 5 hours of videos I've done right now. But Forrester said, he wrote a book on how that's not what's going on. He said, what's really going on, he says, you're making the problem worse. By building more houses where there's a housing shortage, you're making the problem worse because you never thought about the feedback effects that are going on here. The reason there's a housing shortage in the inner city is because the economic core of the inner city is dying. There are no jobs anymore. And because there aren't any jobs, there isn't any income. And because there's no income, there's no profit motive to build houses and build apartments. And that's why there's a housing shortage. That's the reason there's a housing shortage, because the inner city, economic core is dying. So all you have done by building more houses is to basically attract people, and they made this very cheap housing, to attract people to stay in a place that already didn't have a sufficient economic support system to give them work. You now have more people living there, right? And this was as I say, you've made the problem worse. Well, he caught hell for this. He wrote this in a book, and he figured, nobody's going to read the book. And then the people at Housing and Urban Development who were building the houses read it, and he's like, hey, I'm sorry. I mean, that's the way I see it. I'm not trying to jump on you, but I think that what you're doing is counterproductive. It is making the problem worse. Building houses made the housing shortage worse. This one up here, a system dynamics study was looking at forest fires, and the idea is this. A lot of forest fires are caused by underbrush, old dry underbrush. And so they thought, well, let's get rid of that. If we get rid of the old dry underbrush, then we'll get rid of all the fires. And they were kind of right. Because what they get rid of were the small fires. Except now, the older trees, the big trees, not the underbrush, the ones that were dying out, these created wonderful fuel for big fires. They instead got much bigger fires than they had otherwise. It turned out that the forest needed the small fires. That just let a small fire take place, and it will burn out a particular area. It will basically kill off all the older trees, and brand new growth will come through. So there's, again, sort of a feedback effect that's going on there. That one I don't remember. It had something to do with when they introduced these strict anti-abortion measures in Romania, it actually made things worse. But I can't remember the story on that one. All right, so let's see. You don't need all that. I showed you that. Okay, what are the advantages to system dynamics modeling? Well, you can quantify the non-quantifiable. Things that, how much do you hate that person on a scale of 1 to 10? You can actually put that in, and it actually means something, all right? It's useful in data-poor situations, allows a lot of range for experimentation, it's dynamic, transitions are made explicit, and there's always this, errors become insights. I want to tell you about that. I was working on a paper, I told you that I did a business cycle, actually did a couple of business cycle papers, using system dynamics modeling. And the first one I wrote, I was trying to base it on what Keynes had said, and it wouldn't work. I couldn't get it to create the business cycle pattern. All it was doing was building up to a point and then leveling off. And I looked back at Keynes, and I thought about it. And I thought, I'm doing it wrong. That something that I had left out that I hadn't thought was that important turned out to be the key to the whole thing. And so it ended up being an insight. And this is something that system dynamics modelers talk about, that when something doesn't work, it forces you, in a way that pattern modeling doesn't, it forces you to face the fact that really all these things aren't adding up the way I thought they would, and we're not getting the pattern that we expected. Now it's a very, very popular approach, by the way, in environmental, energy, and business disciplines. system dynamics is not popular in economics. It has a following in institutionalism. It gets very complicated very quickly. It's way too easy to add more variables. It's not good at treating space. It's good at treating time, but it's not good at treating space. Let's say Arkansas versus Tennessee. Why are people migrating? It does well with why do people migrate into Arkansas from 1950 to 1960, but it doesn't do well with Arkansas to Tennessee, not with space. Doesn't usually provide numerical forecasts, and this is the big one right here. It's really hard to explain what you did to someone else. They're so complicated. Here are two models that I did. The first one is on interest rate parity, which is an exchange rate concept, and that one's not too bad. Here's my model of the business cycle. It's really hard to explain to somebody else what I did in what year is this? 2013? Heck, I don't remember. I mean, I have a basic sense of what I did, but I don't remember exactly how I set it all up. So that makes it difficult as a scholar to communicate to someone else what you did. And that's important. Unfortunately, if that's the way the real world works, it just means that it's very difficult to explain to people how the real world works. All right, oh yes, and I wanted to mention here too, that Steve Keen, someone whose work you had to read for the last exam, he used a system dynamics model to predict the financial crisis. He was voted as the person who most accurately forecast the financial crisis. That's what this is about right here. He won the Revere Award. And he used this, the chaotic dynamics explored in this paper, and he used a system dynamics model. Here is his model. Here are all the equations. And here are the patterns that he created. This is an old paper, so what year is it? 1995. So the graphics are kind of crappy. Now, but what he basically determined with this was that as private sector debt increased as a ratio of income, that the likelihood of catastrophic collapse became higher, and that once we did collapse, it's extremely difficult to recover. Basically, exactly what happened after the financial crisis. So that's system dynamics modeling. Now, let's finish up. Let me see here. Let me pull up here the study questions. So let me make sure that, okay, I have the sound on. I did that once too. I did a bunch of videos for intermediate macro. I didn't have the sound on, so I had to redo all of those. All right, so I'm looking over at the monitor and it has a little red dot, so I think I'm okay. All right, let's look at these last study questions here. So you've got, I've done all these, 89 through 95, and I shall repeat again that this is every lecture question for the rest of the semester, so you can now complete all your study questions if you wanted to. And now I'm going to talk about some of these others here. Path to understanding institutionalist perspective must start with what concept? Of course, I want you to read the chapter because I do think that this chapter is actually pretty good in terms of explaining what is so unique about institutionalism, and it's really hard to understand in general, as I keep mentioning. So I think the chapter does a good job. So I want you to read the chapter. But I am going to tell you that Homo sapiens are social animals. We're pack animals. That's the big thing you have to remember with this school of thought. It is so different from the neoclassical and Austrian, which focus on the individual. They do the opposite. They're like, no, the culture is determining the individual. The culture is determining the rules of the game. Individuals can certainly have an impact in changing those rules, and that's discussed in the chapter. But for the most part, we follow the rules. Now, let's see. This is an easy one to look up, 97. I'm not going to say much about that. 98, notice here, is related to what I was just talking about with hiring, with the non-racist employer. There's a little discussion of that in the book. Democratic problem solving. Small d means for the average person. That's not the answer. You have to look it up, but that's the basic idea. Domus James. Notice on these next two, it's just about that article, or that chapter of the book, actually, by Domus James when he's talking about Latin America. He says that the issue blocking development is inadequate institutions. What does he mean by that? And to what can a great deal of it be traced? And what's a consequence? Why did the tremendous inequities arise in the first place? And so on. All right. And then how do institutionalists feel about learning the rules of the game versus agents' motivations? You already kind of know that. And then what's the most common attack on institutionalism? Which is going to be that they don't know math, but you'll be able to look that one up too. But those are all pretty easy. Then there's a video by a guy named John Kenneth Galbraith, who when I was in school was extremely famous, even in non-academic circles. And this is from a video series he did called The Age of Uncertainty. You only have to watch the first 8 minutes of it, but I want you to answer that question here about, he's an institutionalist. I'm sorry, I should have pointed that out. He's an institutionalist, and he's talking about some of the ceremonial values that are important to understand the development of capitalism. Then, and his son teaches at the University of Texas, as it turns out. Then, last, and I believe there's a 108 as well. Yeah, there is. So, last is this article by Ann Mayhew, who was one of my professors at Tennessee, one of my favorite professors. And it talks about somebody named Clarence Ayres. Now, Clarence Ayres was a professor at University of Texas. As I've mentioned, this was a hotbed of institutionalism. A lot of my professors from Tennessee came from University of Texas, probably because they didn't want to have to change and buy new shirts and hats. They still said UT and they were still orange. And he was responsible for creating a lot of the institutionalists. He was apparently a very good instructor. It was his stuff that I was really reading when I first got to TCU, trying to figure out what institutionalism was all about. So, she's writing a paper about Clarence Ayres' view on technology, pragmatism, and progress. And it's going to be very familiar now that I've gone over all this other stuff, but I want to mention one thing here that I think is really interesting. And that is, he believed, both Ayres and Veblen believed that there was no essential difference between our own modern society and that of primitive peoples. Hence, our science is no different from the process by which the Pueblo mythmaker tried to make sense of the world, pardon me, except for what critical distinction. And this is sort of sums up the whole aspect of institutionalism, where it asks you to look at your world from a critical perspective, to stop taking for granted behaviors that you carry out. And I find that so fascinating. So anyway, and I'm just going to read this quickly so that you still have to read the article, but let's see, I'm sorry, that's the wrong answer. The actions of the spirits, of the gods and spirits of other times and places had not been measurable or observable, and so mythic attribution remained untestable. So he's saying that the Pueblo mythmaker, sure, is trying to do the same thing that a scientist is. Explain where the earth came from, why the moon, rises at night and so forth. But they had it attributed to gods and spirits, right? And there was no way to observe the gods and spirits and to write down their behavior and to take measurements and to test. That's what's different about scientists. Scientists are still doing the same thing, but their particular culture, scientists, they believe that measuring and testing is very important. And so to continue the rest of the answer, the stories of scientists, on the other hand, could be held up against the machine processes that gave rise to modern stories, and so modified or verified as against technological standards. So the scientist stories can be tested and adjusted. The Pueblo mythmaker, this god did so-and-so. How do you know that? Well, I just know. Okay, so that's everything. I did want to point out one more thing about that article that we were just talking about. Is it here? Yeah, it is. Perfect. One other thing you're going to see in that article by Mayhew about Clarence Ayres is this sort of sense that Ayres really wished we could get rid of the ceremonial, all right? Now, that doggone it, if only we could do everything instrumentally, then we'd be solving problems and be pragmatic and so forth. And not to say that he doesn't realize this, but it's very unrealistic. I mean, if Homo sapiens are pack animals, are social animals, the culture is so important to us, then this is terribly important to us. These beliefs that we share make us feel like part of the pack. These beliefs that we share, even if they are ridiculous beliefs, make us feel safe. And so, as a consequence, being a Homo sapien, that's always going to be important. We at least need to be aware of the damage that we do with the particularly nasty ones of these, and to try to focus on this, but we're never getting rid of that. We're never getting rid of well, I assume, perhaps I'm being wrong here, but the idea of fashion is totally ceremonial. And so, and people who hang out in different social groups tend to dress the same way. It's very important to them. Just don't be making fun of people that don't dress like you, I guess, is there's a good song by the Dead Kennedys on this. But anyway, and that's it. All right, so let me, wrong direction. So, that's everything for the institutionalist stuff for exam 3. Again, you can do all of the study questions now, every single one. You can get them all knocked out and done. And then we're going to do, the next video will be new institutionalism, then the feminist economics, and then a horribly depressing way to end the semester, ecological economics and sustainability. And if coronavirus weren't enough, then that'll do it. So anyway, thank you for listening. May the force be with you.